Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video I'm going to try and answer various questions that people have posed on this topic, Pandiatonicism. Like, what is it? What are we talking about? Where does it get used? How does it get used? All these kind of questions that have come our way. So in the next few minutes, I'll try and unpack the topic for us. There's lots more to say about it, but at least hopefully by the end of this, you'll be a bit clearer if it's something that you're intrigued by, but not fully sure what we mean by it. Well, think about unpacking this for a start. What does pan mean? Pan means all. And then what about this diatonic thing? Well, diatonic, when we talk about something being diatonic, we mean that it's in a key. If I play a piece of music in C major, it's in a key. It's in the key of C major. Could be a minor key, whatever. So pandiatonic. So that name sort of implies that we're playing music in all keys, does it? That could be one way of looking at it. Or does it mean that somehow we're using all of the keys within a particular diatonic scale? It could mean that. But it's a kind of separate brand from atonal music, which is really saying this is music that's not in a key. So if we can't say that we're in the key of F minor or E major or something, but actually maybe there's no kind of tonal center at all, that the chords are quite dissonant, that there's no kind of sense of function within a key from one chord to the next, well, that's sounding like atonal music. Whereas what we're talking about here is something that has some kind of root in tonality, but as we're going to discover, there's a fair bit of freedom in the way we use it. Okay. So we're talking about music that uses notes of the diatonic scale, but doesn't use notes of the chromatic scale. So if I'm in the key of C major, the notes of the diatonic scale are C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. So I'm not going to use D flat, E flat, F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, because those are what we would call chromatic notes if we're referencing something to the scale of C major. Okay, the harmony is based on the diatonic scale, but the harmony is non-functional. So in other words, when we're writing a more conventional piece of music with conventional rules of harmony, we're saying we've got chord 1 followed by chord 5 followed by chord 4 followed by chord 5 and so on, and there's a kind of coherence about the progression of one chord to the next. So we hear functioning harmonic progression. That's what we mean by that. But in this style, we can use those chords that belong to the diatonic scale, but they don't have to function. We can use this chord followed by that chord. If the two don't really kind of progress one to the other in a conventional way, we're not going to worry about that too much. So we have more freedom to work. But we can also find in the pandiatonic style examples of music in which we've got more than one tonality going on at the same time. So you might have what we call, bitonality, for example, where you've got two keys going at the same time. So music adopting these various approaches is said to be pandiatonic. Well, where does this term Pandiatonicism come from? Well, it was a term that was introduced by a writer called Nicholas Slonimsky in a book that he wrote entitled Music Since 1900. So his definition of it is that you can use any formation of any number of notes up to all 7 degrees of a diatonic scale. So in C major, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then obviously coming back to C. But these 7 notes would be the 7 notes in the diatonic scale of C. So he's saying you can use any formation of any number of notes using those 7 degrees of the diatonic scale. So this might amount to, in the harmony, using triads, but maybe having added notes, because in conventional harmony, if we're building chords on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, we're just adding the third and the fifth above each note. So we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then we come back to 1. But what he's saying, Stravinsky, is that we could have some of these triads, but we could have added notes. So I might decide to take chord 1, C, E, G, but I might think, well, could I have an added second? C, D, E, G. Or could I have an added sixth? C, E, G, A. Or could I have an added seventh? Or could I have some combination of that? Could I have the sixth as well as the second? So I get that. So there's a certain amount of dissonance going on there, but I'm still using the notes of the diatonic scale. So that's his kind of definition of it. We're not limited to those possibilities, but that's the idea behind it. His proposal as well is that the bass normally determines the harmony. So if you've got C at the bottom, well, it's that to which you might have a C chord, add a second, add a sixth, add a seventh, whatever you're going to do. But that C at the bottom determines the harmony. And in this pandiatonic language, chord building is usually tertian. In other words, we're building in thirds, and a lot of it relates to chord extension. So what do I mean by this? Well, if I take chord 1 in C major, it's built up in thirds, isn't it? C, E, G. So I have a root, the third above the root, and the fifth above the roots. But that's tertian because these notes are a third apart, these notes are a third apart. So tertian, building in thirds. So extended chords just carries on building in thirds. So if that's chord 1 and I add a B, I've done another extension of a tertian nature. I've added another third to it to make it a seventh. Add another third to make it a ninth, another third to make it an 11th, another third to make it a 13th, and so on. So building chords in this tertian way, this kind of chord extension by adding more thirds. But of course, in the pandiatonic style, we can have these chord extensions, but we don't have to worry about resolving them because we're not worrying about functional harmony. So for example, if I use a chord extension, like I could be in C major, I could decide to use a 513, but then it's kind of pulling me to 1, 513 to 1. So that's a functioning 513. Okay, there's a function that takes us from 513 to the 1. Well, what we're saying in this style is we might want to use that 513 chord, but we don't have to worry about the function of it. It doesn't have to resolve to 1, could just go off somewhere else, wherever a composer decides to take it. So it's non-functional in essence. And we find that this pandiatonic approach is often used in what we call a neoclassical style. So that's a kind of branch of music headed up by Stravinsky, but there are many followers of Stravinsky, and really it's just part of this kind of collapse of tonality that goes on around 1900. Different composers respond in different ways, and Stravinsky's approach was to kind of look back and think, what can we take from the Baroque period, from the classical period, and can we re-engineer it in various ways? So lots of things look like Baroque or classical music, but actually it doesn't sound like it. And that's often because of this going on. So he's taking a pandiatonic approach to the writing of melody and harmony in particular, and doing this idea of added chords, extension chords, but non-functioning chords, and this idea that it could sit in a pandiatonic place. So he often writes bitonally, for example. So we see it in Stravinsky and many others. I mean, for example, this chord that we're looking at the beginning on this sheet comes from Stravinsky's Symphony of Psalms. And what you find here is you've got an F major chord. That's just a straightforward F major chord, but it's built on a bass note that doesn't belong to that chord. It's not massively dissonant that we've got B flat in the bass underneath it. So you hear what we've got? We've got B flat, and then F major chord on top. So it doesn't sound entirely consonant, does it? Because the B flat doesn't belong to the F major chord. Now you can see the F major chord as an extension on the B flat in the bass. If you take a tertiary approach to that, we go up in thirds. When we get F, A, C, do you see how this F, A, C comes about as a tertian extension of the chord starting on the B flat? So you could see it as an extension from the bass B flat. You can also see the bass B flat as a dissonance with the F major chord that we've got up here. All that sounds consonant, this sounds dissonant with it. So you can see it either way. But the point about it is, because we're in this pandiatonic style, that bass note B flat doesn't have to resolve. If a composer of an earlier period had written this chord, B flat with F there, the B flat would have resolved to A. And then you'd have thought, ah, it's a bit of musical tension that's then resolving. But that's a functional approach. Whereas in this example in Stravinsky, well, you can look at that and say, I don't need to resolve it. But you can look at it in two different ways, as an extension from the B flat in the bass, or as an F major chord upstairs with a B flat that doesn't belong to the F major chord. So it has a kind of tension of its own. But whatever it is, it's not resolving in a functional way. So I hope that's beginning to make sense. So that's the first example we're looking at the top Stravinsky. But we find the pandiatonic approach being taken in lots of different musical styles. So, for example, you find it in jazz sometimes. Look at the second example here. So we're now looking at this one, and you can see this is something in a totally different style. Okay, doesn't sound at all like the Stravinsky, does it? But this is another kind of pandiatonic approach. And you can see what's going on there. You can look at those notes and say, well, if I look at all of those notes, it's using these diatonic notes, these 7 notes in the scale of C major. But actually, can you see chords that look like chords 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7? Not particularly. You can kind of explore them in different ways. They certainly don't function. You see these thirds in the right hand, so this idea of tertian building is there. But we see all these fourths in the left hand. All this pars of fourths creates a certain dissonance, doesn't it, when you do that? So we're using these diatonic notes of the scale of C major, but it doesn't sound like the diatonic chords of C major, and it doesn't sound like harmony that's functioning, yet it's working in a different style, different from the Stravinsky style, but it's still pandiatonic. So I hope that's kind of making sense. We find other composers using it. I mean, Henry Cowell, note clusters built in the same kind of way as well. So the pandiatonic style is often using diatonic notes, but using them quite freely, using them in dissonant combinations without reference to any kind of traditional resolution or progression. And the idea is the sound of any particular chord stands in its own right. So you just play the first chord of that second jazz thing and you think that chord stands in its own right. Okay, there is a sort of progression because all the notes move up one, they all move up one again. Then we get a bit of contramotion between the two clefs, and again contramotion, and then we set off in similar motion. There's some kind of design behind that. There's some thought for progression. So I'm not saying that it's just random, but in terms of diatonic progression, it's not functioning in any particular way. So every chord stands in its own right, and you can decide how you want to progress without having to have regard for the conventions of harmonic progression. So you'll notice as well, though, that we're only using those 7 notes of the scale of C major. So we're not using any chromatic notes or any non-diatonic notes. We're sticking with these 7 notes, aren't we? So there's always a strong sense of tonality. Do you hear that in C major? Well, it's a bit debatable, but when you kind of think about it, absorb it, well, it's the only key you can kind of reference it to. So there's a real sense of C major tonality without it completely functioning. Okay, interesting in pandiatonic music that we often find a preference for major keys over minor keys. There's some use of modes made, but often pandiatonic composers feel more comfortable in major keys than minor keys. Why is that? Well, we know we've got the harmonic minor, the melodic minor, we've got the natural minor. I mean, things can move around. Maybe that works less well in this particular style. But an interesting challenge to composers out there to see if you can write in this style in minor keys happily, and what you do with them. Do you stick with one of those minor forms? Do you mix them? How does it work? You know, how does it go? And in terms of chord hierarchy, there still often remains a sense that the primary chords are perhaps of greater importance than the remaining chords. So chords 1, 4 and 5 are perhaps stronger, but I don't think that's nearly as strong as it would be in conventional diatonic music. So who else uses this stuff? We've talked about Stravinsky as being a kind of key player. The music of Prokofiev, you'll find it there. Ravel uses it. Hindemith uses it. Milhaud uses it. Copland uses it. What's interesting is that these are composers all coming from different corners, aren't they? You know, I mean, Prokofiev is from that 20th century Russian school. Ravel sitting in France, sitting somewhere else altogether, really. Milhaud, a member of Les Six, you know. Hindemith doing something in a Germanic tradition. Copland in America, you know. So people are coming from all sorts of different corners and taking a different take on this pandiatonic opportunity. So let's have a look at the third example on the sheet here. And this is from Copland, and it's from his third symphony. And what's interesting about this is you see this other sense of the pandiatonic style. There's a very clear sense of key, but actually there's a very clear sense of 3 keys all operating simultaneously. So when you look at this top line, we've got this. Well, that's very much rooted in D, isn't it? Is it D minor? You know, I don't know, D major, D minor. It's a little bit in the cracks. The C natural sort of feels a bit more minor, doesn't it? But it's certainly rooted in D, so you can sense there's a kind of tonality of D at the top. Okay, well, what about looking at the middle line of this? That looks as if it really belongs to C major, doesn't it? So it's kind of like there's this D thing at the top, there's this C thing in the middle. Okay, what about the bass line? Let's see what's happening here. Well, that could be B flat major. We haven't got any E flats at this point. Could be F major, you know, but it's somewhere else. The point is, though, that really when you look at this, you see that there are really 3 different keys operating simultaneously. So that's another angle on this stuff. Now, one thing that I find very interesting about the pandiatonic style is that many people see this as an alternative to the serialism of Schoenberg and the other members of the second Viennese school, Berg and Webern. Well, serialism, as you may well know, was this notion that we try to liberate every semitone of the scale by taking all 12 chromatic notes inside an octave, and then we organize them in some order of the composer's choice, and then we use them forwards, we use them backwards, we use them upside down, we use them upside down and backwards. We can transpose any of those formats wherever we want to, and we organize that whole thing so that it means that there's a kind of chromatic equality. All notes are equal. We're using every single semitone of the scale, and you can see that that's a very different approach from the pandiatonic approach, which is saying, okay, we're not being functional, we can be dissonant, but actually we're sitting in this kind of sense of a diatonic framework. So some people say, well, you know, the Pandiatonic approach is a kind of counterbalance, if you like, to the serialism of Schoenberg. Well, I think there's a lot of truth in that, actually. A lot of composers have gone down the serial route. A lot of composers have gone down this route. But really, I mean, serialism was such a clear move away from any diatonic basis at all by liberating all the chromatic notes of the scale, all 12 chromatic notes being given equal significance, you know, the formation of a note row based on that. It's interesting that that's not the approach of the Pandiatonic style at all. Stravinsky suggested that Pandiatonicism is a diatonic counterpart to serialism. He kind of explained how it's perfectly possible to compose a melody made up of 7 different notes of the diatonic scale, and then to organize them in the way that the serialist did. So you could order your 7 notes as you wish. You could then say, I'll have them upside down. I'll have them backwards. I'll have them backwards and upside down. So he kind of had this notion that you could serialize it, even though you're just using those 7 notes of a diatonic scale. Other people have thought that this is a rather sort of strange notion, that really the Pandiatonic approach is a different approach, so therefore why would you want to take a serial approach to something that's not essentially serial, certainly from a pitch point of view. But it's an interesting issue, isn't it? You know, how do you see it? Do you see the Pandiatonic style as an alternative approach to serialism? Do you see it as a parallel approach? That's up to you to decide, really. Personally, I see it as an alternative approach, but certainly something worth considering. One professor preferred to define Pandiatonic music as this: C major that sounds like hell. Well, that's one way of putting it, isn't it? Well, we've all got to be our own judge of that. But have a listen to the Pandiatonic approach taken by Stravinsky, Copland, others we've talked about in passing today. Come to your own conclusion about what you see is going on here. But I think in understanding 20th century music, it's very useful to plug into this angle on it so that we understand where so many of these composers are coming from. And if you are a composer trying to do something that doesn't sound too conventional, well, this might give you a spark of some fresh thinking that hopefully will be useful. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you want to kind of dig in further in terms of your own musical study, go to www.mmcourses.co.uk and you'll be able to find access to all of the online courses that we offer at Music Matters, covering things like composition, analysis, oral training, keyboard harmony, all sorts of things that might be useful to you. Also, while you're on the home page, just click on Maestros. There's a link there to Maestros, and that will tell you all about our global musical community that we've created. Lots of perks for you there that may well interest you, including the opportunity to meet with the other people in the group once a month, where we have a monthly live stream complete with live chat so people can ask questions, make comments, we can share stuff with each other, where I try to make a solid input of teaching every month, where we might go into much more detail on a topic such as the one we've covered today, and where composers, performers, people getting ready for harmony exams, all the rest of it, can submit their work. I'll give you personal feedback on it, something that we'll share in the whole group so we can learn from each other. So I hope some or all of that might be of interest to you.